Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, and we'll get started. I know people will start to kind of trickle in a little bit, but first I want to say when we decided that we wanted to start this meeting, we started this meeting with me having Makar in mind. This is not an exaggeration. It was a countdown until he comes, no pressure. But for those of you who don't know Makar or haven't had the chance to hear him speak yet, Makar actually has had a long, fulfilling career in finance, had his MBA in 2009, but his passion for couples and helping couples develop healthy, God-fearing relationships grew. So he actually went back and got his training in marriage and family therapy, and he's been practicing now, done countless hours of therapy as well as lectures and talks that some of us may have heard. If you haven't, you will see why I'm hyping him up. So I hope that you guys are ready and can welcome Makar with us. He had a long drive to get here, so we really appreciate it. So.
All right. Hi guys, how you doing? It's a big blessing for me to be among you, and we're going to have a great discussion together, okay? We're going to talk about, God willing, expectations in marriage, and I'm going to talk louder than whatever's going on out there because it's, okay, sure. I mean, it's the kids playing, it's kind of nice. God willing, with God's grace, we're going to, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and God, amen. With God's grace, we're going to talk about expectations in marriage. And of course, life would be much easier if everyone met our expectations. Wouldn't life be so easy if everyone just met your expectations? Honestly, I could just walk out now if that was the case, right? We don't need to talk about anything else. Life would be even easier if everyone knew our expectations as soon as they formed in our minds. Like as soon as I had an expectation, others knew it. Wouldn't that be amazing? But until then, we must accept the reality that a few things. One is that our expectations are often unknown to us. Sometimes we don't even know our own expectations. Can I give you kind of an extreme example? It's not marriage related, but it's family related. I remember when I was younger, I found out that my mom passed through menopause, so we couldn't have kids I couldn't have any more siblings. And when I found out, I got so disappointed. I was like, wait, so I didn't realize that I wanted a little brother until I found out that my mom couldn't have kids anymore. I didn't even know that. I didn't know I had that, right? And often we have these unknown expectations. So that's one thing that's real about expectations. It's probably the main one we're going to talk about. But is that our expectations are often unknown to us. The second reality about expectations is that they are, by the way, I remember last time I was in this church, every time I say the P sound, it kind of does something with the mic, so sorry about that. I'm going to try to step back every time that letter. You don't hear it? Is this me? Okay, all right, that's all right. Okay, I'm sure something expectation related there. All right, the second thing is that our expectations are often imperfect. So first I said they're unknown to us. Second, I'm saying is that our expectations are often imperfect. There's issues with my expectations. Of course, no one wants to accept that, right? I'm willing to accept that I don't know my own expectations. Okay, fine. But to tell me that my expectations could be a little wrong, I don't know if I want to accept that reality, right? What are some ways they could be wrong? My expectations could be inconsiderate of the other person's perspectives or circumstances. I just have these expectations, but I didn't spend time, even if I know my expectations, I didn't spend the time to say, is this expectation considering all the things I need to know? All the facts? Maybe not. You could be expecting someone to do something, but they're not in a position to do it. Or a very, very common and very critical point in a marriage is, not in general, but in specific times, is if they are both simultaneously in need of a tremendous amount of support. At those moments when they're both struggling, they're both suffering, neither of them is very much in a place where they can support the other person, but both are expecting support from the other person. That's a very tough moment, and couples are in that, at a reasonable frequency. So sometimes our expectations are inconsiderate of the other person's perspectives. Another way our expectations could be imperfect is maybe our expectations are bad for us, or we have low expectations. We have poor expectations, right? That's another way our expectations could be imperfect. Maybe you're expecting, the support you want, it's possible for your spouse to provide it, but it's not the right support you need, right? Maybe you're looking for your spouse to be your savior. Maybe you're looking for your spouse to compensate for personal work you should have done 20 years ago. Maybe you're looking for your spouse to do what your father or mother never did for you. Even if your spouse can do that, because they're probably doing it for your kids, it's a bad expectation for you to have. It's a low expectation, right? You're expecting your spouse to do for you what you should do for yourself. That's a bad expectation. So that's the way it could be imperfect. And of course, also another way that your expectation could be imperfect is that it could be based in bias. There could be bias in your expectations. And of course, you guys know, and the term is kind of overused, or used in many different contexts, which is unconscious bias. Like, it's not like people who are biased want to be biased a lot of times, but you just don't realize that you have a bias, right? So just to go, back one level up, our expectations are often unknown to us, and they are often imperfect. And the third thing is, which is very, very important, is that our expectations are imperfectly communicated. I'll see you later, guys. Yeah! Our expectations are often imperfectly communicated. What if you have a good expectation and you're aware of it, but you do a bad job of communicating it? That's a problem. So, and by the way, communication has two sides, right? There's a person delivering the communication, and there's a person receiving the communication. You could be, the person on the other side could be doing a really bad job of receiving the communication. But you know what? You could also be doing a really bad job of communicating or delivering the expectation. So you can't just look at both sides, at one side, right? We usually look at the side that means less work for us, right? That's how our minds work. Brains are like lazy in this on Earth, right? So if there's something else that someone else can do, you kind of prioritize them doing their thing before you prioritize you doing your thing. That's why Jesus said, look at the plank in your own eye before you look at the speck in your brother's eye, right? So that's how we have to think. So and so now we're saying with these three realities, when they happen, it leads us to the common place, which is unmet expectations. So expectations are unknown, expectations are imperfect, expectations are imperfectly communicated, which leads to unmet expectations, which leads to disappointment, frustration, and one thing which we don't often talk about, but there's a handful of topics we talk about. Let me just put on our list one day. We need to talk about grief. We need to talk. Always need to talk about sex, and we need to talk about aging and life transitions. These are very important topics we don't talk about a lot. But unmet expectations leads to grief. Grief, because there's a loss. There's something lost. You had a hope, and the hope is not being fulfilled, and you might even realize that it will never be fulfilled. Right? For example, let's say you had this hope, an expectation that when you get married, your you're going to just have all your family and your spouse's family like together all the time, holidays and, feasts and just events and whatever, right? And then it's no longer met. That expectation there could be 100 reasons why that doesn't work out. Some that are simple and some that are very complex. And what do you do in that situation? You could keep banging on the table, say, we have to make this work, blah, 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 blah. But eventually you need to get to a place where you grieve that loss. Something died. The hope has died. All right. Are you guys with me so far? Is everybody with me? I know it's Sunday, but I promise I slept less than you. Unless you pulled an all-nighter. I promise I slept less than you. So we're all going to keep going. So I want to also say, next point, is that there's nothing wrong with expectations in general, right? You need to have expectations to get through life, right? You can imagine when you're driving, it's pretty good to have the expectation that everyone else on the road, just like you, is not trying to get into an accident, right? You could imagine what life would be like if you expected things to go wrongly all the time. Now we're talking about like anxiety, right? Like severe anxiety too, if you're expecting everything to go wrong. So when you drive, you have almost maybe even an unconscious expectation or an expectation you're not aware of that everyone else is trying to be safe. And you're trying to be safe too. And you need to do that in order to get through the day, right? Like you just need to be able to get through the day. So you have so expectations are not bad. It's also okay, I'm being a little silly here. It's okay to expect your spouse to not cheat on you, right? And you can imagine what it would be like if you did not have that expectation, right? If you're always worried that your spouse is going to cheat on you. That could just lead to lots of explosions every day in your home, right? If you're always worried and anxious about that, right? So you need expectations in and of themselves are not bad things. But what we said earlier and what we'll say later is what can make expectations lead to marital issues or relational issues. So, where do expectations come from? Where do they come from? They come from a few places. One is they come from things we've observed. So that especially expectations that were formed from just observations, those are very likely to be unknown or unconscious expectations, right? Like you saw how your parents were treating each other. Is this being recorded? It is? Okay. All right. So I just want to know what examples, like how I could say some examples. So, for example, there's someone that I was working with, and he came from parents that were not married, and he's in a relationship with a woman who came from parents who were married. The question that they came to me for is, should we get married, right? And they're like living together and doing all this stuff, right? So, and it's not a completely Christian couple either, but I'm trying to illustrate one point, that one of them is just observe two parents doing life and raising him, right? They were separated, right? And the other one observed life with two parents married. Those parents ended up getting divorced, but observed most of her life, her parents being married and raising her. So, and now they're asking, should we get married? The question I had for them is, what is marriage? Right? Like when you say married, what are you saying? Right? And it's a big question, right? But let's say you see, when we talk about sexual intimacy or any sort of intimacy, physical intimacy, did you see your parents kiss in front of you? Like, how would they respond? You know, if dad reached over and hugged mom, would mom be like, oh, you know, or would she hug him back? Or who would initiate? How about so all of these things are forming your expectations, often not because of any conversation, just from observation, right? Now, another thing is, another source of expectations is things we learned. And those two, they come from two things. One is things you were told or education. And I'm going to give you two examples. Are you guys with me so far? Is everybody with me? Is this interesting? Or okay, all right, good. So I'll give you an example that I love to use for this. One time I had a client. Her parents were divorced and she was staying with her mother. She came to me now like 15 years after this, 15 to 20 years after this incident that I'm going to tell you. One time, she was with her mom, and they were cleaning something in the home before her parents got divorced. And somehow the conversation came up of like, why doesn't dad help with this? And the mom said to her, don't ever wait for a man to help you with anything. That's what the mom said. She said, don't ever wait for a man to help you with anything. She was a young kid. And that got like seared into her mind. Now she's coming to me, she's married, right? What's her complaint? My husband doesn't help me. See where this is going, right? Her husband tries to help, but she doesn't wait for him to do anything. She doesn't give him space to do it his way. Because she got this message of don't ever wait for a man to do anything for you, right? And a lot of times, she might not even ask the question. She just starts working, doing stuff. She doesn't even ask, right? And she's burning out. She's stressed. And then she's frustrated. Why aren't you helping? And all because of this message that was told to her, right? Now, another thing that we learn is we learn through education. I remember a pediatrician telling me something. The pediatrician had just become a mother, and she was telling me, she said, but in my training, I have delivered hundreds of mommy talks in the hospital, right? And the mommy talk is like when a mother delivers a baby, the doctor, like, it tells you how to, like, some just high-level tips on how to take care of the baby, right? And so the pediatrician would say to the mom, one of the things was, breastfeeding is best. You should breastfeed as much as you can, right? That was it. That was the message. But after this pediatrician had a child, that pediatrician had problems breastfeeding. The baby wasn't latching on to the breast very easily, and it created so much stress for that mom. And then she said, even though I learned that breastfeeding is best from a nutritional perspective and from a hormonal perspective and all this stuff, I'm gonna deliver that message very differently to the new moms, right? So do you guys get what I'm saying? Right? So education said one thing, but it wasn't like it was an imperfect expectation. It was imbalanced, right? Two other things where expectations come from. The reason I'm telling you this is because I'm gonna tell you later to please challenge your own expectations. Please become aware of your expectations. Where did they come from? Before you just hammer down on someone else, ask yourself, is my expectation, should that be my expectation? Or should I adjust my expectation? I'm giving you now a full range of possible things to look at for how to challenge your expectations. Another source of expectations is things you experienced, especially traumas, right? So if you experience a traumatic event, an expectation might be formed, or that event will always happen, right? Or that event can happen again. And then you're going to become anxious around that event happening again. So I always like to my wife is going to kill me for I got to ask her one day if she's okay with me telling this example. But I will ask her, one day. I will ask her today. I will ask her soon. Yes. No. But I'm just going to tell you, yeah. No, it's fine. It's not that bad. But one time, so when she was younger, she was driving and she switched into a lane, right? She's switching into a lane. But there was another car that switched into that lane, and they ended up hitting each other, right? And it was kind of, I wasn't there. I don't know who messed up. Let's just say everybody messed up. But the point is, she's a very, safe person, like on a more risk-averse side. And so now she doesn't like to switch lanes if there's a car in the adjacent lane that you're switching into. She just doesn't like to do that. Like if there's an empty lane here and she's here and there's a car here, she doesn't want to switch into this lane out of fear that this car is going to be switching too, right? There's a traumatic event. Getting into an accident is traumatic, right? So what am I going to say? No, just go, keep switching. It's not easy. This stuff affects you, right? You can't just tell someone who experienced a trauma, get out of it, hurry up. It's irrational. Doesn't make sense. What are you going to do, never switch lanes? Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to live? No, you can't say it. That's insensitive. That's insensitive, right? You got to be more sensitive, right? People are going through things. And then the last thing that expectations come from, of course, is things you agreed to, right? And here, there's a communication point and a power point and all this stuff, which has to do with, like, are you really agreeing? Or are you just, throwing out things and then walking away? Or not being clear? Or yesing the other person? Are you actually agreeing? Are you thinking through before you agree? Are you exerting pressure to make the other person agree? Like, these are all, like, fine, on paper, the words, if I looked at it on paper, you agreed. But did you really agree? Right? And that's the question. By the way, I always want to tell you, you have a long time, right? Like, a lot of times we feel like things are so urgent. We have to come to an agreement right now. But most things in life are not permanent, right? You also have a lot of time. This discussion isn't going to be the only discussion. You could pause, come back to it, right? You don't have to exert so much pressure. You don't have to feel so much pressure. You don't have to be so anxious about what's going on, right? You could discuss it more and more and more. You can agree to try something and revisit it in a week, right? There's so many options. It's not black and white, right? When you get married, you are accepting more and more of the gray and the uncertainty of life. It's essentially, when you get married, it's more surrender. You're giving up control, right? And you're not giving it up to the other person. You're just giving it up. I mean, really, you're giving it up to God. But also you're giving it up to the circumstances of the world, the imperfect circumstances of the world, right? Because before you're married, you control a lot of things. But then you get married and now there's two opinions. And also, when there's two opinions, it's not like things are going to take twice as long to make decisions. It might take 10 times as long to make decisions. Because now one person shares their opinion, the other person shares their opinion, now you got to talk about it, and then you got to maybe find a third option, and then you got to, things take a lot longer. It's a lot grayer, right? What if you know how your day went, but you don't know how your spouse's day went until you talked with them? So you don't know what getting home is going to look like. You don't know, right? Is that bad? It's just life, right? It's just life. So if you're coming home and you have these expectations, which we'll talk about, rigid expectations, that's an issue. All right, is everybody with me so far? Am I going at an okay pace? Am I going too slowly? You guys are with me? Okay, all right. Now, so just to recap real quick, we said that life would be easier if everyone knew our expectations before we formed them. Life would be easier if our expectations were always met, but of course they're not. And that leads to unmet expectations. Expectations in and of themselves are not a bad thing, and expectations come from things we observe, things we learn, things we experience, including traumas, and things we agreed to. Now, I have just 3 more things to talk about. What are some common problems with expectations, common poor expectations, and then how to avoid them from hurting your marriage, okay? So, what are some common problems with expectations? Okay, I'm just going to tell you 3 of them. One of them, like we said, we already spent time on it, is not knowing your expectations. That one we discussed, that's a common problem. And it's probably the most common. And even if you know your expectation, you probably have not leaned into it, dove into it, and worked on it, and figured it out, right? And challenged it. The second common problem with expectations is having unrealistic expectations, right? Like sometimes we just need to stop, just stop wanting what you want, right? Like, and I know that sounds crazy, right? But you can't, life is not just about only what you want. You have to negotiate with life, right? You have to negotiate. And also, the biggest problem with expectations, besides not knowing it, is rigid expectations. And I want to spend a few moments on that. One of the most beautiful qualities you could ever have as a person is flexibility. Flexibility. Be a flexible person, please, my beloved brothers and sisters. Be flexible. Be agile. You know, you can't predict anything. And you see how Jesus was, right? He treats one person this way, one person that way, one person this way, one person that way. The Samaritan woman says this. He says, oh, okay, good job. And then he's like, can I have some water? She's like, why are you asking me for water? He's like, oh, okay, sure. Then how about this? And how about that? And how about this? And how about that, right? Just flowing, right? Flexible. We have to be flexible. And please, honestly, I don't even know what you should be rigid about. Because even when we say, like probably if you're, a very, someone who's committed to the church and everything, you're probably going to say, be rigid about the faith. That's right. But that's probably, you probably don't mean the right thing when you say that. You probably mean be rigid about, going to church at a certain time, tasbih at a certain time, and all that stuff. But you're willing to throw your whole family into the ground in the morning just to make it to church on time, right? So that's not the faith. God is not saying destroy your family, but make it to liturgy on time, right? That's not what God is saying. So what I want to say is, in general, be flexible, right? Like I remember a newly married husband, man, it's very, people have good hearts, but the execution can be so bad, right? Like he said, he's newly married, and he said, my wife, before I got married, I used to come, like she knew this about me. I used to come to church on time every Sunday, and I was on church on time, And then he said, after we got married, she's like late. She's getting. I thought he was laughing. His cry sounds so cute. Was he laughing? Oh, he was so cute. Yeah, my son is almost that age. He said after we got married, she's like she wakes up late. She wants to get ready and blah blah. And I end up getting to church like 30 minutes late. And I get to church and we're already so upset with each other. I can't even focus and pray. And I'm like, yeah. You can't focus and pray. So what are you going to do, man? You going to fight every Sunday? Can you change her? No. Just take it easy. Just get to church when you get to church, or go in two separate cars. Find a way. But don't fight. Like, why fight? You think after the 27th fight, your wife is going to say, oh, I was waiting for the 27th time that we fight, so that now I get it. It makes sense. That 27th time you yelled at me and disrespected me, that's what I needed. Thank you for yelling at me 26 times and going the extra 27th time. No. Right? And for what? It doesn't make so don't be rigid. Don't be rigid, okay? And of course, we talk about the other examples. Somebody, when we were younger, this used to be the example. Thank God it's probably not anymore. We're a lot more advanced, I think. If somebody comes into church dressed a certain way, whatever it is, piercings, tattoos, or everything. I think, in the older generations, used to be like, oh, what are you doing here? And you make them feel so bad, right? That was the older generations. Now we get it, right? It's not, what are you going to do? Somebody's coming to seek God. Their heart's probably in a better place than me, right? And all of us. And they're coming to seek God. You don't know what they went through to walk into this building, right? And you're going to tell them, oh, you can't be here because you're not dressed a certain way? Like, please, please. So don't be rigid, okay? Be flexible, okay? So, why are our expectations rigid? One, we think our expectations are the best. Like the best. I have the best ones, right? Of course, you should do what I expect because my expectations are the best. Or you make it about black and white or right or wrong. Most of the time, most of the time, it's not about right or wrong. It is definitely not black and white, most of the time. It's gray. Where in the spectrum? It could take you a long time to figure it out, but I'd rather you spend the time to explore that than to just lazily choose one end of the spectrum. It's not black and white. And maybe you're an inflexible person, which is a character flaw. You have to ask yourself, am I an inflexible person? Do I have a hard time receiving influence? Do I have a hard time with change? And please don't just like think about that question, because a lot of people like to say, "Oh, I have a hard time with change. I don't like change." Of course, yeah, nobody does. But do you have a very, very hard time with change? You know, change is the process of dealing with change is kind of like grief, by the way. All right, now I want to talk about 5 common poor expectations. Any questions so far? All right, I'm going to keep going. Okay, I only have 2 more pieces to this. Okay, what are 5 common poor expectations? Number 1 is expecting your marriage to look like someone else's. Don't do that, okay? Let your marriage look like what you and your spouse want it to look like. Of course, that should be guided by what God intended for your marriage, right? Because God has a general, God didn't say you have to live in this location or that location, or you have to go on this many date nights, or you have to have sex this many times. God didn't say that, right? But he did say you have to honor each other. You have to wash each other's feet, minister to each other's needs, seek God, right? That's what God said, right? This is a lifelong commitment. It involves sacrifice. Like, there's a lot of those things that you have to have guiding your marriage. In that sense, everyone's marriage should look the same, right? It should look like Christ and the church, right? Christ and me and you, right? But besides that, and social media has made this much worse, right? Because social media is like a comparison engine, you know? It's like, if you want to compare anything to anything, especially what's not going well in your life to what's going well in everyone else's life that they're posting about, Instagram and everything will help you so much if you want to do comparisons. It's ready for you for free, at no cost to you, right? At least financially, or maybe financially. What people have, how much time they have, how happy they are, how many kids they have, their vacations. It is very unfair for you to expect your marriage to look like someone else's. Maybe if you pick like a virtue, right? Or if you pick like a good quality they have. But even then, if you're going to look at a virtue in someone else's marriage, please let me just give you a shortcut here. Or just say, I want to solve this problem for you. Don't say, honey, why doesn't our marriage look like that? What I want you to say is, why don't I do what that spouse does? You guys get the difference? Like, you have to see why you're not doing what you admire in that marriage. Don't say why my spouse isn't doing the same thing with me that they're doing together. Okay, you guys get what I'm saying on that point? Another common poor expectation is expecting for no crises to happen. I'm sorry. There will be crises. There's going to be a crisis. At least maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. I promise when I raise the number, I'm not jinxing anything. We don't believe in that, right? But there will be crises, right? There's going to be them, whatever it is. And because in this life, God did not promise us a problem-free life. That's not we're on earth, right? We're on earth. This is a broken place. It's already an imperfect place. And we're imperfect people. There will be crises, right? There will be crises. So that's a bad expectation if you're expecting for there to be no crises. Another poor expectation, number 3, is expecting, please pay attention to this, it's a kind of a long statement, expecting to discover nothing new about yourself that you need to change. Let me just say it in a different way. You should expect to discover something new about yourself that you need to change in marriage. Because marriage confronts you with you, right? Because there's no one else in the world that's affected by you as much as your spouse. It's a unique relationship. There's nothing else like it, right? So when you get married, it's a very intimate connection. That means, okay, fine, maybe you had, your temper was bad, but your coworkers just go home at the end of the day. But your spouse is with you all the time, right? That's why when we talk about like the toothpaste and the toilet paper and another one that comes up is like leaving the shower curtain open or closed, whatever it is, all that stuff, that like the other person has to live with that, right? So they're gonna be affected a lot more than maybe anyone else ever was. You're gonna be like, wait, why all of a sudden are they telling me about my anger issues? No one ever told me I had anger issues. Yeah, because everyone else could walk away from you, right? Everyone else could just go. They don't need to. And your parents, there's a power there's a power differential. They could just be like, okay, you're our son, you're our daughter. We don't just get out of here. You're wrong. They're probably the ones with the anger problems too, right? So if you expect to discover nothing about yourself, you're in for a treat, right? Because you're gonna discover something about yourself that you need to change. Okay, you guys with me on that? Okay, please. And I'm saying this, I say this to myself too. Please, I have many things I need to change. I also want to tell you the fourth one, a common poor expectation, sounds very similar, but it is so different, which is expecting to discover nothing new about your spouse that you cannot change. Let me say that a different way. You will discover new things about your spouse that you can do nothing about. Nothing. 0.0000000, like nothing. You can't do anything about it because you cannot change anyone. You can't even change, it's hard enough to change yourself, let alone someone else, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to try to change your spouse? Good luck. I'll see you in therapy. No. No. So, but you guys get what I'm saying, right? So you should expect to find new things that in your spouse that you cannot change. Of course, an important caveat here is if you did the premarital process correctly, then it shouldn't be any major things, right? If you did your premarital process correctly, it shouldn't be any major things where you're like, whoa, that is a deal breaker. And you can't really, not really deal breakers after you get married, very few exceptions. So the last common poor expectations, and then we're almost done, is expecting the passage of time alone to solve major issues. Expecting the passage of time alone to solve major issues. Time passing by itself is often not going to solve anything. What it usually does, though, is it puts you in a better position to approach the problem. But it doesn't solve the problem, right? So the way to solve problems is to work on them, right? You have to talk about them. You have to read. You have to consult credible people. And you have to work on them. You can't just sweep it under the rug and hope it's not there in 5 days. And by the way, that 5 days can turn into 5 years, into 30 years. And then you look back on your life and you say, why did I let all this time pass, right? Which is a big thing that the aging population is going through, right? That they look back and they're like, why didn't I do X, Y, and Z with my child? Why didn't I do X, Y, and Z with my spouse? And you don't want to realize that, and I'm definitely not saying this as a threat or ultimatum kind of thing, but you don't want to realize that when it's too late. And that's not why I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying the reason I'm making that point is because it is possible to think that time alone will solve issues, and you just keep letting time pass, and life gets busy, 30, 40 years, and then issue never got resolved. And then you look back and say, oh, I just read this book in my 50s or 60s, and it taught me this new way of communicating. I thought I heard something like that when I was in my 30s. But I probably should have done that. And here we are, right? All right. So now I want to tell you how to avoid poor expectations from hurting your marriage. And then we'll be done, okay? You guys with me? All right, okay. Number one, and some of this I've kind of weaved into the above, is number one, be aware of your expectations, especially their origin. So that's 2 points, which is, what are my expectations? Like, why am I disappointed? If you're disappointed, why? Probably because there's an unmet expectation. What is my expectation? And then, where did it come from? You can see, before you say anything to your spouse, you have a lot of questions for yourself, right? You have a lot of things to think about, see, with yourself. Second thing now is challenge your expectations. Are they perfect? As I always like to say, there's 1,000 ways to say anything, right? There's 1,000 ways to say something. You can say something 1,000 different ways. Also, there's 1,000 expectations you could have had about the same thing. Is your expectation, is that the one you must have, or can you have another one, right? Number 3, communicate your expectations as needed. Of course, you have to kind of, first, there's a point about the tone of your communication, and then also whether or not you communicate it, right? Like, because number 1, do not communicate expectations as a demand. Please, and I want everyone, please just take this phrase, the softness of your tone. Just that phrase, softness of your tone. Ask yourself, am I conscious of the softness of my tone? Because a lot of us were in different work environments, where we grew up in different families, all this stuff, and sometimes our tone is our biggest obstacle, right? So if you have an expectation, you can bring it up lightly, like a slow startup, right? As Gottman talks about, like bring it up. Hey, I have an expectation. Like, hey, I wanted to share an expectation that I had, or there was something I was thinking about that I was hoping we can do. Is this something that we can agree to do, right? And you bring it up that way. And of course, no one here is living to serve you, so you also have to choose which expectations you're going to be communicating, because you can't spend all day telling someone your expectations, right? Sometimes you just got to be flexible, let go, accept that you're not going to get them all. Number 4, so we said become aware of your expectations, challenge your expectations, communicate your expectations. Number 4 is learn about your spouse's expectations. You know how to do that? Is you ask questions, man. Just say, hey, what are you expecting today? And this could be very simple. With very healthy couples, like couples that are like good at this, they do it quickly, and like, unless it's a big issue, but they do it quickly. Like they're on their way to someplace. Hey, when do you want to leave, right? And especially if it's like, or like, what time do you want to leave, or what time should we head out, or what are we going to do with this? It's just really quick, very transactional, right? In a good way. And if it's a big thing, they know how to spend the time and talk about it respectfully, right? But ask questions about your spouse's expectations. Like, for example, there's a couple, it's very common with premarital couples where where the woman in the couple has a lot of expectations and dreams for how her proposal's going to be, right? And that was a tough one, right? Because, she's trying not to tell him how she wants it, because she wants it to be a surprise. And he's like going crazy trying to find people who have heard about her expectations over the last 20-something years. And, and then there's maybe an unmet who knows? But the point is, I'm just using that to kind of illustrate an extreme example. But learn about your spouse's expectations and ask questions. Number 5 is be patient with your expectations being fulfilled. And this one I just want to spend a moment on, which is that your expectations might be right, like it's a good thing to expect, but they might not be for right now. They're right, but not right now, right? Why? Because you're both going through different journeys. Your spouse is going through a journey that you don't know much about, and you probably will never know much about. That's God knows about it. But your spouse is going through a journey. I'm not saying it's a bad one. I'm not saying it's a hard or easy one. But they're going through a journey that you don't know much about. You know some things, you might think you know a lot, but you don't. Always, never underestimate your own ignorance. That's for all of us, especially about our spouses. So, you might have a good expectation, but your spouse can't get there right away because they're going through stuff. And you're not the one who should be determining their priority list of what to work on, right? Like they are going through things. Can I give you an example? There's a couple I was recently working with. The guy in the couple, he's kind of rigid and idealistic. Idealistic, which makes him rigid sometimes. So he wants the best. He wants his relationship to go really well, and he wants the best out of his partner. So he often is critical or expresses disappointment in, she is not responding in a very thoughtful way sometimes, especially in public, right? It's not extreme, but just not how he wants it. He's very idealistic, right? And so, and then we found out just a few weeks into the work that she's dealing with a lot of anxiety that's coming from her parents being very critical of her whole life. And there we are. We have a guy, the male partner is very idealistic and rigid and critical, and she is dealing with anxiety because her parents were very critical when she was younger. And that is a very difficult combination, right? Because he's critical about her, and that's the worst thing, that's the last thing she needs right now, right? So now we got to help her work out through her anxiety. But until she works through it, he's not going to get what he wants. And he has to be patient because she's on a journey. And he also needs to be on a journey to be more flexible and sensitive, right? So you guys get what I'm saying there? We're almost done. I know we talked for a long time. All right, almost done. So the last two things, last two individual points, and then we're done, is cope in a healthy way with unmet expectations. So if your expectation is unmet, please don't yell or scream or fight or insult or criticize. Again, like I said, that is not going to all of a sudden get your expectations fulfilled, right? Find a constructive way of responding. And which leads us to the last thing, which is grieve expectations that will never be met. Some expectations will never be met. And you have to start to think about that possibility because you need to move forward in life. You need to move forward in life. And you can imagine, just to help you appreciate this point, you can imagine someone losing a loved one, and them, when we say they never move forward, right? They're always stuck in that moment, right? And they're never leaving their home, nothing is changing in their lives, they've stopped being productive, and you tell them, well, you need help because you need to get to move forward because you're stuck, right? I'm not saying you stop loving the person or you forget about them. There's a whole process around grief. But we need to do the same thing with our expectations that will never be met. We need to let them die and move forward, right? Because there's life to live. There's still more life to live. And you don't want to be held back at that unmet expectation. All right, that's the end of the prepared material. You guys were very patient and great listeners. Any questions, comments, concerns, disagreements? Unmet expectations? Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I want to say a phrase which is different does not mean incompatible, right? Different does not mean incompatible most of the time. So, but the way to work, and for those who didn't hear the question, like how does a couple work through the fact that one grew up in, for example, a very affectionate home where there's a lot of affection being communicated, very clearly, and another home where there might have been affection, but you could barely detect the communication of it, very transactional in what's going on there, right? Like they probably do love each other, but they just function more. And the other one is more like hugging and affirming and lots of I love yous and all this stuff, right? How do you deal with that? Well, the first step is to acknowledge the difference, to agree that there's no right or wrong, and then make requests. Make very clear requests. But do not, the common pitfall is that the couple, one of them says, well, like, why doesn't he know that I need to hear I love you? Why doesn't she know that I need a hug? Like, well, you didn't say anything, bro. Like you didn't say anything. So, but if you make the request and say, hey, can I have a hug right now? And your spouse says, no. That's a very different issue, right? But we're usually not talking about that. Well, usually the issue is that one person wants a hug, they don't even know they want a hug. And so they didn't say anything, and now they're just frustrated. They say they don't emotionally support me. My spouse doesn't support me emotionally. And that's it, and everyone just walks away. But you need to know that, hey, I really love that hug that I got from my parents when I was facing this type of issue. And you just say, hey, honey, can I make a request? I realize that there's something that would make a really big difference for me if you were to do it. Oh, okay, sure. And usually, and a lot of times, if it's brought up that way and there isn't already a lot of conflict in the marriage, that it's a very fine thing to do, right? Can if you ever see me, can I get a hug right now? Or if you ever see me when I come home from work, can you please give me a hug when I come home? Is that possible? And that's it, right? And sometimes, sometimes we don't want to do that because also it completely exposes us to rejection. And we don't like that vulnerability. And also, we have this myth that if I communicate my expectations, it's less special when my expectations are fulfilled, that's Hollywood, right? That's not real, right? No one is reading anybody's mind. No one, even if you want that. It's not gonna happen, right? So if you want a hug, you gotta ask for the hug, right? And if they say no, then there's something to work through, right? Why not? Sometimes, by the way, you might find that, and if they say no, it might not be necessarily a relational issue. It might be a personal issue that's leading to a relational issue, Like maybe someone, for example, extreme example, experienced some sort of physical abuse. And so touching is not something, Or maybe, whatever it is, So is that helpful? Yeah? Okay, great. That's a great question. Yes? Yeah, great. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things there, and so for those who didn't hear the question, like, what if sometimes if you're the one on the receiving end of the expectation message, sometimes you feel like you're being told what to do, so you don't want to do it. There's two things there. One is probably there's an opportunity for the person telling to do a better job of communicating. Maybe, and I love the word requests. Make requests. Like, hey, can I request something? Can I ask for something that would make a big difference to me, right? And also, you can't control what your spouse is doing. So if your spouse, maybe, let's just say hypothetically, has a character flaw where their tone is bad, you can't control them. You can make a request of how they could adjust their tone when making a request. But what I want to encourage you, because you can control yourself as much as you can, is see it as like a cry out for support. Like sometimes people are like, you this and this and this and this and this and da 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 da. And if you're detached enough and like clear enough in your mind and emotionally healthy enough, you could see through all of that and just see there's a little child inside sitting in a corner crying. And they've been asking for this for 30 or 40 years and no one's given it to them. And they don't even, they could try as hard as they can and they can't even come up with the words to ask it because they've never seen anyone ask for it correctly. And that's where Christ is. That's where Christ is. Christ is in that moment when you love unconditionally, when you're approached with someone who is broken and weak and in need, and you say, I'm going to minister to that person. And by the way, what else is marriage about? Right? I mean, I'm broken too. It's not just my wife. We both bring brokenness into our marriages, right? I'm just a lot more aware of the other person's, right? Usually. Does that answer your question? Yeah? That was a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah. So just to make sure I understand your question, like if you think there's optionality in the expectations, like you could expect multiple things that are fine, but your spouse is really choosing one thing, and you think that thing that they're choosing is the less ideal or a less than option than the other options. Is it okay for you to go with what your spouse wants, even though you don't think it's the best thing? Yeah, I would say welcome to marriage. Yeah, that's marriage. Like I love to say this phrase from Esther Perel, a famous therapist. She says she has a lecture called "You Could Be Right or You Could Be Married." I love that, right? It doesn't matter a lot of times if you're right, as long as you're together. It's peace. Like a lot of times parents fight so hard about what's right for their kids on the most like minute by minute. Should we feed him this? Should we feed him that? Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do this? Right? Nobody cares. You know what your child really needs? Harmony in your marriage. That is the best gift you could give your child, is a healthy marriage. Because your marriage is the primary source of information on how marriage should be for them. Unless they do a lot of work to unlearn and learn and all that stuff. But they're probably not on average. So yeah, we're going to go with the flow. We're together. We get lost together. Is that cool? And you know what you could do too is, it's not just going to, you have the discussion, and sometimes you see what happens after. Like sometimes, and please watch out for the I told you so's, like just don't do that. Our spouses are not idiots, right? Like you might sometimes think they are, but they're not, right? Our spouses are not waking up in the morning trying to have a bad life. They're like, hey, how am I going to destroy my life on my spouse's life today? That's not what they're doing. They're trying to do well, but they're imperfect just like everyone is. So what you can do is let the results speak for themselves. And maybe if you're disappointed, like, oh man, yeah, I wish that didn't happen either. Maybe we can try something different next time. At least there's still harmony, which is what really matters. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Great. By the way, and also don't forget how patient God is with us. God is with us. I could be walking into sin, and God doesn't leave me, right? Like sin, and I'm talking about sin. And God is still there. He's in Hades. He's in hell, right? He's everywhere. So, that's how God is with us. So we could be with our spouses in the less than ideal things that we think are less than ideal, Yes. Yeah. No, it is. It is like the 5 stages of grief or whatever, like construct, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the first step is to acknowledge that something has died. And usually it works best when you're writing this down on your own. Like you write it down. Like, what have I lost? And think of like, I've lost the hope for X. That's usually a common one in this context. I've lost the hope for X. And if you contributed to that loss, apologize for it. Like I'm sorry for my contribution to this loss, which was X, Y, and Z, and whatever. And then I forgive X, Y, and Z for contributing to this loss as well. Because one of the issues is that keeps you from getting through grief in a healthy pace is bitterness. Like you didn't forgive the person, whoever they are. So I forgive. And then any other significant emotional communications, like, when you're writing about it, like if I had this, like, I'm so sad to lose this hope for this because my life would have been like X and Y and Z and all this stuff, And then what you say at the end of this letter is goodbye. You have to say goodbye, like say bye to it. And that's it. And just to touch on the grief point for a moment, in life we accumulate sadness and accumulate happiness, like sad, like losses, because we're only accumulating. It's not like we're living backwards. So you're only going to accumulate more and more losses as you get older. There's going to be more. Sadly, that's just life. That's Earth, right? That's where we are. But you're also going to accumulate good things, hopefully, I'm sure. And so, but they don't cancel each other out. You have to process the negative ones and enjoy the positive ones. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Great question. So it's not a black and white answer, because you can't assume that because you have a message to deliver, or that the other person is able to receive it. And that's what happens when, like, in an example we might all appreciate, is like if a parent passes away. Whenever there's a loss, especially a death, our hearts and minds go through this automatic process of reviewing the whole relationship, the whole history. We start thinking about everything, right? And all these things start to come up, experiences, this, that, all this stuff. But the question is, sometimes you realize, I should have, had a discussion with my dad about this. But a lot of times, if your dad, if my dad was alive and I tried to bring that discussion up, the discussion wouldn't have gone well. It would have turned into a fight. So, and that's the brokenness of life. That's just it. So you have to, before we talk in general, in communication, you have to have a high certainty, level of certainty that the discussion will go well. We can't just speak. Like, whenever we open our mouths, we need to make sure that I can see why this would go well, because I'm going to say it this way, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to consider this, and the timing will be this, and the tone will be that. That's how we should all speak in general as people. And that applies to those expectations. Yeah. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you. Glory be to God forever. Amen.
Thank you so much, Makar. I can see that we actually don't want the talk to end, but I have good news, HRC. I'm not going to let him leave until he gives us another date to come back. So that I promise you can help trap him before he leaves. But thank you guys so much for coming. If there's any feedback or suggestion for future topics, let us know. And thank you so much, Makar. It really was very beneficial, and I believe it is recorded. I'm sure we would all benefit to listen to it again and kind of dissect the information. Thank you guys.